The morning sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood by his office window, watching the early staff prepare for another day of royal duties. His fingers drummed against the glass as he contemplated a decision that would shake the very foundations of his marriage and the monarchy itself. For months, whispers had echoed through the palace corridors about Camilla's family members and their growing influence within royal circles. What started as innocent visits from her relatives had gradually transformed into something that made Charles deeply uncomfortable. The Queen Consort's brother, Mark Shand, along with several cousins and distant relatives, had begun treating the palace like their second home. Charles had initially welcomed this closeness. After decades of public scrutiny and criticism regarding his relationship with Camilla, he wanted nothing more than for her to feel completely at home in their new life together. When she suggested that her family should be more involved in royal functions, he had agreed without hesitation. It seemed like a natural progression of their relationship, and a way to show the world that their love had triumphed over past controversies. However, what began as occasional family dinners quickly escalated into something far more concerning. Camilla's relatives started appearing at private royal meetings, offering unsolicited advice on matters of state. And, worst of all, some had begun making unauthorized statements to the press about internal royal affairs. The situation reached a breaking point when Charles discovered that one of Camilla's cousins had been secretly recording conversations during family gatherings at the palace. The king's private secretary, Sir Edward Young, had presented him with a detailed report that morning. The document outlined a series of incidents that painted a troubling picture of security breaches and potential threats to the crown's reputation. There were records of Camilla's relatives sharing confidential information about upcoming royal engagements with outside parties, photographs being taken in restricted areas of the palace, and even attempts to influence royal charitable partnerships for personal gain. Charles felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just from Camilla's family, but from the situation itself. He had worked tirelessly to restore dignity to the monarchy after years of scandal and public doubt. The thought that his own household might be compromised by those closest to his wife filled him with a mixture of anger and profound sadness. The decision he was about to make would not only affect his relationship with Camilla, but could potentially create a rift that might never heal. Yet, as the sovereign, Charles knew that his duty to protect the institution of the monarchy must come before personal considerations, even when those considerations involved the woman he loved. As he turned away from the window, Charles caught sight of a photograph on his desk showing him and Camilla during their wedding day. They looked so hopeful then, so united in their vision of the future. Now, that same future seemed threatened by the very people who should have been supporting them. The king picked up the red telephone on his desk, the direct line to his private secretary. His voice was steady but carried the weight of his decision as he spoke the words that would change everything. "Sir Edward, please arrange for a private meeting with the Queen Consort this afternoon. We need to discuss her family's immediate departure from all royal residences and functions." The die was cast. Charles had made his choice, prioritizing the crown over family harmony. As he replaced the receiver, he wondered if Camilla would ever forgive him for what he was about to do, and, more importantly, whether their marriage could survive the earthquake he was about to unleash. Outside his office, the palace continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within hours, the royal household would be forever changed. Staff members went about their duties, preparing for what they assumed would be another ordinary day in the life of the British monarchy. They had no idea that their king was about to make one of the most difficult decisions of his reign, one that would test the very foundations of his personal happiness and royal duty. The afternoon meeting would bring everything into the open. Years of careful relationship building, public acceptance, and personal joy hung in the balance. Charles knew that once he spoke to Camilla, there would be no going back. The conversation would either strengthen their bond through honest communication or create a chasm that might prove impossible to bridge. As the hours passed toward their scheduled meeting, Charles found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the early days of their secret relationship, through Diana's death, the public's gradual acceptance, and, finally, their wedding, every step had been carefully measured against his duty as future king. Now, once again, that same duty was calling him to make a choice that could cost him dearly on a personal level. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did that morning, as Charles prepared to confront the woman he loved with a truth that might destroy everything they had built together. The Blue Drawing Room had witnessed countless royal conversations throughout its history, but few carried the emotional weight of the meeting about to take place that Tuesday afternoon. Queen Consort Camilla entered the ornate chamber expecting a routine discussion about upcoming engagements, her leather-bound diary in hand, and a warm smile on her face. She had no idea that her husband was about to deliver news that would shatter her sense of security and belonging within the royal family. Charles stood with his back to the door as she entered, his hands clasped behind him in a posture she had come to recognize as his way of preparing for difficult conversations. The afternoon lights streaming through the tall windows created sharp angles across his face when he finally turned to face her, and Camilla immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. "Thank you for coming, my dear," Charles began, his voice carrying a formality that made Camilla's heart skip a beat. After years of marriage, she knew every nuance of his tone, and this was not the voice of a loving husband but of a king about to deliver an unpleasant decree. "Charles, what's wrong?" Camilla asked, setting down her diary and moving closer to him. "You look as though you haven't slept in days." The king gestured for her to sit in one of the gilded chairs, but he remained standing, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm he was about to reveal. He began by outlining the security concerns that had been brought to his attention, speaking in measured tones about protocol breaches and unauthorized access to sensitive information. Camilla listened with growing confusion and alarm as Charles detailed incidents involving her family members that she had been completely unaware of. Her brother Mark's conversations with journalists, her cousin's photography in restricted areas, and, most shocking of all, the recordings that had been discovered during a routine security sweep of family gathering areas. "I don't understand," Camilla interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Are you saying my family has been spying on us? That's absolutely ridiculous, Charles. These are people who love us, who have supported our relationship through all the difficult years." Charles finally sat down across from her, leaning forward with his hands pressed together as if in prayer. "I know this is difficult to hear, Camilla, but the evidence is overwhelming. Your family's access to the inner workings of the palace has created security vulnerabilities that I simply cannot ignore. As king, I have a responsibility to protect the monarchy, even when it means making painful personal decisions." The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla stared at her husband with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. She had given up so much to be with him, endured years of public criticism and media scrutiny, and now he was telling her that her own family was being banished from their lives. "So what exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her voice now carrying a steel edge that Charles had rarely heard before. "All members of your extended family must be removed from their current positions within royal functions," Charles replied, his words carefully chosen but devastating in their impact. "They will no longer have access to palace grounds, royal events, or any official engagements. This includes Mark, your cousins, and anyone else who has been granted privileges based on their family connection to you." Camilla stood abruptly, beginning to pace the room as the full implications of Charles's words sank in. "You're asking me to choose between my family and my role as queen consort," she said, stopping to face him directly. "After everything we've been through, after all the promises you made about us being a team, you're making this decision without even consulting me." Charles rose as well, reaching out to her, but Camilla stepped back, avoiding his touch. "This isn't about us," he insisted. "This is about protecting the institution that we both serve. Your family's actions have put that institution at risk, and I won't allow that to continue. My family has done nothing but support us." Camilla shot back, her composure finally cracking. "They've been loyal through everything, never asking for anything in return except to be included in our happiness. And now you want to throw them away based on some security report." The argument that followed was unlike any they had experienced in their years together. Camilla accused Charles of paranoia and ingratitude, while he remained firm in his position that duty must come before family loyalty. She reminded him of all the times her relatives had defended their relationship in public, how they had stood by them when much of the royal family had been distant and cold. Charles, for his part, tried to explain the impossible position he was in as sovereign. He spoke of the delicate balance between personal happiness and royal responsibility, of the constant scrutiny that meant every decision had far-reaching consequences beyond their marriage. "Do you think this is easy for me?" Charles asked, his own voice beginning to crack with emotion. "Do you think I enjoy destroying the very relationships that have brought you comfort and joy? I'm trying to protect everything we've built together, including your position as queen consort." Camilla laughed bitterly. Protect my position? You're isolating me from everyone I care about. You're turning me into exactly what your critics always said I was, someone who would never truly belong in this family. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that neither would yield their position. Charles remained convinced that the security of the monarchy required these drastic measures, while Camilla saw his decision as a betrayal of their partnership and a rejection of the people who had loved and supported her throughout her life. The meeting ended without resolution, with Camilla storming out of the blue drawing room, leaving Charles alone with his decision and the growing realization that he might have just irreparably damaged the most important relationship in his life. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, filled with the weight of words that could never be taken back and decisions that would reshape their marriage forever. That evening, as Charles sat alone in his study, he wondered if he had made the right choice. The crown felt heavier than ever on his shoulders, and, for the first time since becoming king, he questioned whether the price of duty was too high to bear. The transformation within Buckingham Palace was immediate and unsettling. What had once been a harmonious household now operated under a cloud of tension so thick that even the longest-serving staff members began to notice the change. Queen Consort Camilla had not spoken a single word to King Charles III in the 3 weeks following their confrontation in the blue drawing room, and her silence was becoming more powerful than any argument could have been. The royal couple's public appearances during this period were masterful displays of professional composure masking personal turmoil. At state functions, they stood side by side, smiled for photographs, and performed their duties with practiced precision. However, those closest to them could see the subtle signs of the war being waged in silence. Camilla's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at Charles, and the king's usually confident demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty whenever his wife was near. Palace staff found themselves caught in an impossible situation, inadvertently becoming messengers between two people who shared the same living space, but refused to acknowledge each other's presence. Her Majesty would like to know if His Majesty will be attending the garden party on Thursday, became the type of stilted communication that replaced the warm, informal exchanges that had characterized their marriage. Lady Susan Hussey, one of the Queen's former ladies-in-waiting and a veteran of royal household dynamics, had seen similar situations before, but never quite like this. The silence between their majesties is unlike anything I've witnessed, she confided to a trusted colleague. It's not the hot anger of a fresh argument, but something much deeper and more troubling. It's the silence of profound disappointment. During this period, Camilla threw herself into her royal duties with an intensity that surprised everyone around her. She increased her charitable engagements, spent extra time with patronages, and seemed determined to prove that she could fulfill her role as queen consort without any family support system. Her schedule became so packed that Charles's private secretary had to coordinate carefully to ensure they wouldn't accidentally encounter each other in the palace corridors. The king, meanwhile, was dealing with his own form of isolation. Having made the decision to banish Camilla's family, he now found himself cut off from the very person whose opinion and support mattered most to him. Charles began taking longer walks in the palace gardens, often accompanied only by his thoughts and the weight of wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake. The situation became even more complicated when Camilla's brother Mark attempted to reach out to Charles directly through intermediaries. Mark had learned about his banishment through official channels and was devastated by what he saw as an unjust punishment for his family's loyalty. His attempts to arrange a meeting with the king were politely but firmly declined, with palace officials citing scheduling conflicts that everyone knew were fabricated. The silence between the royal couple began to affect the entire royal household's operational efficiency. Decisions that would normally be made jointly now required elaborate consultation processes. Garden party guest lists, charitable event schedules, and even household staff assignments became complicated negotiations conducted through intermediaries. The seamless partnership that had characterized Charles and Camilla's marriage was replaced by a bureaucratic formality that made even simple decisions cumbersome. Princess Anne, Charles's sister, attempted to intervene after observing the situation during a family gathering at Windsor Castle. Known for her direct approach to family problems, she arranged separate meetings with both Charles and Camilla, hoping to broker some kind of understanding between them. Her conversation with Charles revealed the depth of his internal struggle. "I know what it looks like from the outside," Charles told his sister, pacing around his Windsor office. "It appears that I've chosen duty over love once again, just like our mother did, just like the monarchy has always demanded. But And if I don't protect the institution, what legacy am I leaving? What's the point of all this sacrifice if we allow it to be compromised from within? Anne's meeting with Camilla was equally revealing, but from a different perspective. He's turned me into exactly what I never wanted to be, Camilla confided, her usual composure cracking slightly. I'm now the queen consort who stands alone, without family support, isolated in this great institution. Everything I feared about this role has come true, but not because of outside forces, because of my own husband's paranoia. The Princess Royal found herself in the unusual position of understanding both perspectives while being unable to see a clear path toward reconciliation. Charles's concerns about security and institutional protection were legitimate, but Camilla's sense of betrayal and isolation was equally valid. As the days turned into weeks, the silence between Charles and Camilla began to take on a life of its own. Palace staff started to whisper about the possibility of a more permanent separation, though such talk was quickly discouraged by senior officials. The British public remained largely unaware of the domestic crisis unfolding within the royal household, as both Charles and Camilla maintained their public facade with remarkable skill. However, the strain was beginning to show in other ways. Charles's sleep patterns became erratic, and he was often seen working in his study late into the night, avoiding the bedroom he shared with Camilla. For her part, the queen consort began spending more time at Mill House, her private country retreat, citing a need for quiet reflection and preparation for upcoming engagements. The palace's senior staff, led by the king's private secretary, began developing contingency plans for various scenarios, including the possibility that the royal couple might require separate living arrangements. These discussions were conducted in the strictest confidence, but the very fact that they were taking place illustrated how serious the situation had become. Behind closed doors, both Charles and Camilla were suffering more than they would admit publicly. Charles found himself second-guessing his decision daily, wondering if his interpretation of the security threats had been overblown. Camilla, despite her outward determination to continue her duties, was experiencing a profound loneliness that reminded her of the darkest days following Diana's death, when she had felt like an unwelcome intruder in the royal family. The silence between them was no longer just the absence of conversation. It had become a presence in itself, filling rooms with tension and transforming their shared spaces into emotional battlegrounds where neither could find peace. The morning emergency meeting in the king's private study was unlike anything the senior palace staff had experienced during Charles's reign. Sir Edward Young, the private secretary, sat across from a visibly exhausted monarch while the director of communications and the head of royal security flanked his desk. The topic of discussion was no longer the original security concerns that had started this crisis, but rather the growing threat to the monarchy's stability posed by the ongoing silence between the king and queen consort. Your Majesty, Sir Edward began carefully, we need to discuss the increasing public speculation about the state of your marriage. The press is beginning to ask more pointed questions about Her Majesty's reduced public appearances alongside yourself, and several tabloids are investigating rumors of a rift within the royal household. Charles rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent over the past month. The irony was not lost on him that his efforts to protect the monarchy from his wife's family had created an even greater threat to the institution he was trying to preserve. The silence between him and Camilla was beginning to generate the very type of negative publicity he had sought to avoid. The communications director, Sarah Mitchell, spread several newspaper clippings across the king's desk. Headlines like "Royal Couple's Separate Schedules Spark Speculation" and "Palace Insiders Hint at Marriage Troubles" painted a picture of a monarchy in potential crisis. More concerning were the quotes from unnamed sources within the palace, suggesting that staff members were beginning to leak information to the press. The situation is becoming untenable, Mitchell explained. We can manage public relations for a short period, but if this silence continues much longer, it will become impossible to control the narrative. The media has started drawing parallels to your parents' marriage difficulties and even to your own first marriage. The head of royal security, Commander James Harrison, added another layer of concern. Beyond the public relations aspect, Your Majesty, the operational security of the palace is being compromised by the current situation. Staff members are confused about protocols, uncertain about communication channels, and some are beginning to choose sides. This internal division creates exactly the type of vulnerability we were trying to prevent. Charles stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where he could see Camilla in the distance, meeting with representatives from one of her charities. Even from this distance, he could sense the rigid determination in her posture, the way she held herself slightly apart from others, as if protecting herself from further emotional assault. "What would you have me do?" Charles asked without turning around. "Abandon my responsibilities as sovereign to preserve domestic tranquility? Ignore genuine security concerns because they happen to involve my wife's family?" Sir Edward exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, there might be a middle path. A way to address the security concerns while also acknowledging Her Majesty's feelings and the damage that has been done to your relationship." The suggestion that followed was both complex and delicate. Rather than a complete banishment of Camilla's family, the palace could implement a structured rehabilitation process. Family members would be required to undergo security briefings, sign confidentiality agreements, and have their palace access limited and monitored. It would represent a compromise that addressed security concerns while offering a path back to family inclusion. Charles listened to the proposal with growing interest, but also with the realization that implementing such a plan would require him to admit that his original decision had been unnecessarily harsh. It would mean acknowledging to Camilla that he had prioritized institutional fears over trust in her judgment and family loyalty. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Camilla was having her own crisis meeting with her personal staff and closest confidants. Her private secretary, Amanda McManus, had been fielding increasingly intrusive press inquiries and was concerned about the Queen Consort's emotional well-being. "Ma'am," McManus said gently, "your schedule for the coming weeks is completely full, but perhaps we should consider scaling back some engagements. The staff is concerned about the pace you've been maintaining." Camilla looked up from the letters she was reviewing, her eyes showing the strain of the past month despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I will not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me retreat from my duties," she replied firmly. "If Charles wants to question my family's loyalty and remove my support system, then I'll prove that I can function perfectly well without either." However, privately, Camilla was struggling more than she was willing to admit. The silence between her and Charles had evolved from angry defiance to something approaching grief. She found herself mourning not just the loss of her family's inclusion in royal life, but the apparent loss of the partnership she thought she had built with her husband. Lady Sarah Keswick, one of Camilla's closest friends and a former lady-in-waiting, had been quietly observing the situation with growing concern. She approached Camilla with an unusual suggestion. Perhaps it was time to break the silence, not to reconcile immediately, but to establish some basic communication that might prevent the complete breakdown of their marriage. "You're both suffering," Lady Sarah observed during a private conversation at Clarence House. "Charles looks as miserable as you do, and this silence is achieving nothing except to damage both of you and the monarchy you both serve." Camilla's response revealed the depth of her hurt. "He showed me exactly where I stand in his priorities. After everything we've been through, after all the years I waited, and all the criticism I endured, he was willing to sacrifice my happiness and my family relationships for a security report. How do I come back from that knowledge?" The crisis deepened when news reached the palace that several of Camilla's banished family members had been approached by journalists offering substantial sums for exclusive interviews about their experiences within the royal household. While they had so far refused these offers, their continued exclusion was creating exactly the type of disgruntled former insiders who might eventually become willing to share damaging information. Palace security also discovered that the original recordings and security breaches that had triggered Charles's decision were less extensive than initially reported. Some of the incidents had been mischaracterized, and others represented genuine misunderstandings rather than malicious intent. This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. As the fourth week of silence stretched on, it became clear to everyone involved that the crisis had moved beyond the original family issues to threaten the fundamental stability of Charles and Camilla's marriage. The two people who had weathered decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges to finally achieve happiness together were now trapped in a conflict that seemed to have no clear resolution. The palace, once a symbol of unity and strength under their joint leadership, had become a house divided, with staff members, family members, and even the royal couple themselves uncertain about what the future might hold. The silence that had begun as Camilla's expression of hurt and anger had evolved into something far more dangerous, a complete breakdown in the communication and trust that formed the foundation of both their marriage and their ability to serve the monarchy effectively. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, exactly 5 weeks after the silence between King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla had begun. It happened not in the grand rooms where their public duties played out, but in the small sitting room adjacent to their private apartments where they had once shared quiet evenings together, reading or discussing the day's events. Charles had been working late in his study when he heard the unmistakable sound of Camilla crying through the walls they shared. It was not the controlled tears of public emotion or the quiet sadness he had occasionally witnessed during their years together. This was the raw, broken sobbing of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their emotional endurance. For several long minutes, Charles sat frozen at his desk, paralyzed by the knowledge that he was the cause of his wife's anguish. The reports and security concerns that had seemed so critical 5 weeks ago now felt insignificant compared to the sound of the woman he loved falling apart in the next room. When he could bear it no longer, Charles set aside his papers and quietly walked to the door connecting their spaces. He found Camilla collapsed in her favorite armchair, still wearing the navy dress she had worn to a children's charity event that afternoon. In her hands was a photograph of her late father, Major Bruce Shand, taken at their wedding day. The sight of her clutching this image while sobbing hit Charles like a physical blow, reminding him of all the family connections he had severed with his decree. "Camilla," he said softly, his voice breaking her name into syllables heavy with regret. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence that had defined their relationship for over a month hung between them. But it was different now, fragile and ready to shatter rather than solid and impenetrable. "I can't do this anymore, Charles," Camilla whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I can't be queen consort to a man who doesn't trust me. I can't represent a family that doesn't really want me. I thought we had built something stronger than the institution, but I was wrong." Charles moved closer, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that would have scandalized royal protocol experts, but felt like the only appropriate response in that moment. "You're not wrong," he said, reaching for her hands. "I was wrong. I let fear override everything else. Fear for the monarchy, fear of criticism, fear of appearing weak. But I never feared losing you until now." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever shared. Charles spoke about the crushing weight of being king, about how every decision felt magnified and scrutinized, and how his role as sovereign sometimes seemed to conflict with his role as husband. He admitted that the security report had triggered all his deepest anxieties about protecting the institution he had inherited, but he also acknowledged that he had used those legitimate concerns to justify what was essentially a panic response. Camilla, for her part, revealed the depth of isolation she had felt not just during the past 5 weeks, but throughout much of their marriage. She spoke about the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of her position, about the loneliness of being criticized for loving someone who was destined to be king, and about how her family's acceptance and support had been one of the few genuine comforts in her royal life. "When you sent them away," she said, still holding her father's photograph, "it felt like you were saying that even you didn't really believe I belonged here. That after all these years, I was still just the woman who had to be tolerated rather than truly accepted." Charles's response was immediate and emotional. "That's not true, and it never has been. You don't just belong here. This place, this role, this entire life only makes sense with you in it. I made a terrible mistake, one that I'll spend the rest of my reign trying to correct." The reconciliation process began that very night, but would take weeks to fully unfold. Charles's first action was to personally call each of Camilla's banished family members, not through intermediaries or official channels, but directly from his private phone. These conversations were difficult and sometimes awkward, as he had to acknowledge his mistake while also explaining the genuine security concerns that had motivated his initial decision. The compromise solution that emerged was more sophisticated than either the complete ban or unrestricted access that had characterized the previous extremes. Camilla's family would be gradually reintegrated into royal functions, but with new protocols in place. They would undergo security briefings, sign comprehensive confidentiality agreements, and have their access to sensitive areas monitored and limited. Most importantly, Charles would personally oversee this process rather than delegating it to security officials. The impact on the palace staff was immediate and noticeable. The tension that had permeated every corridor and office began to dissipate as word spread that the royal couple was speaking again. Staff members who had been walking on eggshells for weeks finally exhaled, The normal rhythms of palace life began to return. However, the crisis had changed both Charles and Camilla in fundamental ways. Charles emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of the personal costs of his royal responsibilities and a renewed commitment to including Camilla in decisions that affected their shared life. He also implemented new protocols for security assessments that required multiple levels of review before any actions affecting royal family members could be taken. Camilla, meanwhile, had discovered reservoirs of strength and independence that she hadn't fully realized she possessed. Her solo performance of royal duties during the crisis had demonstrated to both herself and others that she could function effectively as queen consort even under the most challenging circumstances. This realization gave her a new confidence in her role and her relationship. The public never learned the full extent of the crisis that had threatened to destroy the royal marriage. Charles and Camilla's return to joint public appearances was seamless, and their renewed partnership actually seemed stronger than before to outside observers. The months following their reconciliation were marked by particularly effective collaborative efforts on charitable initiatives and public engagements. 6 months after the crisis, at a private family dinner that included Camilla's brother Mark and several cousins, Charles raised a toast that captured the lessons learned from their ordeal. "To family," he said, looking directly at Camilla, "both the one we're born into and the one we choose to build. And to the understanding that protecting what we love sometimes means taking risks rather than building walls." The silence that had once threatened to destroy their marriage was replaced by a deeper communication and mutual understanding. Charles and Camilla had learned that their relationship was strong enough to survive even the most serious challenges, but only if they faced those challenges together rather than allowing their different roles and responsibilities to drive them apart. The palace had weathered its crisis, emerging not weakened but strengthened by the knowledge that even kings and queens are human beings whose personal relationships require the same care, communication, and compromise that sustain all successful marriages.